The heavy wooden doors of the cathedral creaked open, and a beam of sunlight sliced through the dim, musty air. The woman, her face still damp from tears, stepped out into the bustling corn market square. Her eyes were red from the hours she had spent in the cathedral, confessing her sins and praying to the saints. She was known in the town as a pious woman, and her beauty only added to her reputation. But today, she seemed different, more fragile, as if the weight of her prayers had drained her. Held tightly in her arms was a small boy, his sharp little eyes darting around, taking in every detail of the noisy scene. Donkeys prodded by millers, men on horseback clattering over the cobblestones, and priests and monks in their dark robes. All of it was a spectacle for the boy. His name was John, and he was just 4 years old, but he already had a curious mind. They made their way through the crowd, the woman's steps soft and careful, as if she didn't want to disturb the peace of the cathedral that still lingered around her. John, however, was wide awake, his eyes never still. He saw the millers, the horsemen, and the churchmen, but he also noticed the small details, the way the sunlight glinted off the metal buckles on the horsemen's boots, the sound of the donkey's hooves on the stones, and the murmurs of the people as they went about their business. Finally, they reached their home, a modest house that also served as an office. Behind the leaded greenish glass windows, John's father, Gerard Calvin, sat at his desk, working tirelessly. He was the attorney for the church, a man respected for his shrewdness and his ability to navigate the complex world of church politics. The house was always bustling with visitors, priests, canons, and other church officials who came to seek Gerard's help. They argued, schemed, and sometimes even shouted, but Gerard remained calm, always looking out for his own interests. John and his mother slipped inside, trying not to disturb the work being done. The boy's father was a powerful man in Noyon, a city with a rich history. 500 years earlier, it had become the seat of a bishop, and in the year 768, the great Charlemagne had been crowned King of the Franks here. The massive, dark cathedral that dominated the city was a symbol of its importance, and it was where John had just spent the afternoon with his mother. The cathedral was a place of mystery and awe, filled with relics and images of saints. John remembered the little pilgrimage he had made with his mother to the shrine of St. Anne, the grandmother of Jesus. He had been lifted up to kiss the golden receptacle that held a piece of her skull, surrounded by candles and flowers. The shrine was always crowded, and people believed in the power of the relics. There were other relics in the cathedral too, hairs of John the Baptist, a tooth of Jesus, and even some crumbs from the feeding of the 5,000. The monks and priests fought over these relics, each claiming they belonged in their own church. John's world was one of shrines, relics, and the constant ringing of bells. Noyon was a city of 10,000 people, and it was filled with priests, monks, and other church employees, all vying for power and influence. The bishop, a nobleman from the De Hengist family, ruled over them all. The cathedral was the heart of the city, and its bells echoed through the valley, reaching even the bargemen on the River Wise. But as John sat on his stool in the corner of the house, listening to the voices of the men at his father's desk, he began to wonder. The image of Jesus on the cross, bleeding and wearing only a loincloth, haunted him. Jesus hadn't been rich or powerful, and yet the men who worked for the church seemed to care only about their own wealth and status. John's sharp little mind was already asking questions, even at the age of 4. He wondered if Jesus would be pleased with the way things were, or if he would want something different. And so, in the shadow of the great cathedral, the boy with the sharp little eyes began to dream of a world where things might be different, where the words of Jesus might be taken more seriously, and where the church might be more than just a place of power and wealth. Little did he know that these early thoughts would shape the rest of his life. In the bustling city of Paris, the air was thick with tension. King Francis I, known for his fickle nature, found himself caught between two powerful forces. On one side was his sister Margaret, a devoted follower of the new faith, who pleaded for tolerance and understanding. On the other side were the Beta du Prat group, a coalition of powerful churchmen who accused the king of betraying the Holy Church and allowing heresy to spread. The Sorbonne, the prestigious university, was at the forefront of this battle, condemning the writings of reformers and burning books that they deemed heretical. One of the most prominent figures in this conflict was Jacques Lefebvre, a professor at the Sorbonne. Despite his influence, he was eventually forced to flee to Strasbourg, a city in Germany, to escape the growing persecution. In 1525, his New Testament was publicly burned, and he continued his work in exile. Meanwhile, the writings of Martin Luther began to make their way into France, smuggled in and translated for the people. These texts were banned by the Sorbonne, and anyone caught with them faced severe punishment. But the people read them anyway, and secret printers continued to produce them, fueling the growing unrest in the capital. It was into this volatile environment that John Calvin and his companions arrived from Noyon in the summer of 1523. John, a young and ambitious student, found his way through the narrow, twisting streets of Paris to the home of his uncle Richard, a blacksmith. The city was a mix of old and new, with ancient buildings and modern ideas clashing in the streets. The Place de Grève, a public square, was a grim reminder of the stakes involved. It was there that a converted Augustinian monk was burned at the stake for his Lutheran heresies, becoming the first of many to face such a fate in Paris. John's education in Paris began at the Collège de la Marche, where he was fortunate to have Mathurin Cordier as his teacher. Cordier, a former priest known for his excellent teaching, focused on giving his students a strong foundation in Latin and French. John, who was just 14 at the time, was one of those students. Cordier's influence was profound, and years later, when Calvin became a renowned scholar, he dedicated his commentary on 1 Thessalonians to his former teacher, expressing his gratitude for the early education he received. After 3 years at the Collège de la Marche, John was transferred to the Collège de Montaigu, a place known for its harsh conditions and strict discipline. The college was infamous for its lice, bad food, and the use of whips to punish students. Despite the challenging environment, John excelled in his studies, mastering Latin classics, logic, and the writings of church fathers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. He often suffered from stomachaches and headaches, but his young mind was sharp and ready for the intellectual challenges ahead. During his time in Paris, John made several important friends. He stayed in touch with the De Hangest boys, nephews of the bishop, and his cousin Robert, who had converted to the new faith and later became known as Olivetan, a translator of the Bible into French. John also befriended the sons of the king's Swiss physician Dr. Kopp and the brilliant thinker Guillaume Boude. These connections exposed him to new ideas and debates, shaping his own thinking and beliefs. The political landscape in France was also changing. In 1525, King Francis I was captured by Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and held prisoner in Madrid. His mother, Louise of Savoy, ruled in his absence and was known for her intolerance of heresy. This period saw the persecution of reformers intensify, with many fleeing to safer cities in Germany and Switzerland. However, the common people of Meaux, a town near Paris, showed remarkable courage. They stood firm in their beliefs, even in the face of death. One such person was Denis, who rebuked his bishop before being burned at the stake, and the young Pavane, whose powerful words moved the crowd as he faced execution. Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Clement VII was also in trouble. He was locked up in a tower for 7 months after losing a battle to Emperor Charles V. The city of Rome was looted, and the Pope's authority was severely weakened. In England, King Henry VIII sought a divorce from his first wife, Catherine, and when the Pope refused, Henry broke away from the Catholic Church, making himself the head of the Church of England. This marked a significant shift in the religious landscape of Europe. In Noyon, John's father, Gerard Calvin, faced his own troubles. He had refused to produce certain records of accounts, which led to conflicts with the Church. This experience, combined with his frustration with the Church's greed and arrogance, influenced his decision to redirect John's career from theology to law. John, always obedient, accepted this new path and set out for the city of Orleans, known for its prestigious law school. Orleans was a vibrant city, full of students who lived carefree lives, playing games and attending banquets. John, however, threw himself into his studies with a passion. He ate little, slept less, and spent long hours reviewing his lessons. Within a year, he was known more as a teacher of law than as a student. He also studied Greek under the tutelage of Wolmar, a German professor with Lutheran leanings. This allowed John to read the New Testament in its original language, deepening his understanding of the Bible. In 1531, John received news that his father was seriously ill in Noyon. He returned home to find the house on the Cornmarket Square strangely quiet. The church officials, still angry with Gerard, did not visit. John and his brother Charles turned in the accounts their father had refused to provide. John conducted a service in the chapel of Pont l'Evêque, where he was the chaplain. During his stay, he and Charles discussed the church's problems and the ideas of the reformers. These conversations, along with the recent events in Paris and Rome, solidified John's growing dissatisfaction with the church. After his father's death, John stayed in Noyon for a month, reflecting on his future. The life of a scholar, filled with books and learning, appealed to him. He decided to return to Paris, where King Francis I had recently established a new college of royal lecturers, promoting humanism and new thinking. This decision marked the beginning of John Calvin's journey as a scholar and reformer, a path that would lead him to become one of the most influential figures in the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin's life was about to change in ways he never imagined. After his book on Seneca failed to gain attention, he decided to return to Orleans to finish his law studies. But his plans were interrupted when his brother Charles faced trouble with the church. John rushed back to Noyon to help, but the details of his efforts remain a mystery. Back in Paris, Calvin found himself in the middle of a storm. Nicolas Cop, the rector of the University of Paris, gave a speech that angered the church authorities. Instead of praising the saints, Cop talked about the Gospels and God's grace, and he criticized the persecution of those who were turning to the Bible. The Sorbonne, the powerful theological faculty, was furious. They demanded that Comte be punished. The situation became even more dangerous when it was rumored that Calvin had helped write the speech. The authorities were out to get both of them. Cop managed to escape in disguise, but the police were after Calvin. Students helped him escape through a back window, and he fled the city dressed as a vine dresser, a worker in the vineyards. Calvin's journey was just beginning. He went to Noyon for a short time, but the king's sister, Margaret, intervened and persuaded the king to show mercy. Calvin returned to Paris and met with Margaret, but he knew he couldn't stay. He left again, this time for Angoulême, where he stayed with his friend Louis du Tillet. Du Tillet was a church official who supported the new ideas, and his home was a safe haven. Calvin used the name Charles d'Espaville to hide his identity. In du Tillet's house, Calvin found a vast library and a place to study. He spent his days reading and writing, but he couldn't stay hidden for long. People sought him out, eager to hear his teachings. He held secret meetings in homes, and even in a small cave by the river. The more he shared, the more he realized that his old life was over. He was no longer just a scholar. He was a servant of Jesus Christ. In April 1534, Calvin visited the old Professor Lefebvre in Nerac. Lefebvre was a pioneer of the French Reformation, and he had just published a new French Bible. The two men, one a seasoned leader and the other a young reformer, talked about the future of the faith in France. Lefebvre, nearing the end of his life, may have seen in Calvin the future of the movement. After their meeting, Calvin returned to Noyon with a clear purpose. He stood before the clergy of the cathedral where he had grown up and announced that he would not become a priest. He gave up his benefice, the salary that had supported him. It was a bold move, but Calvin was determined to follow the path he had discovered. On May 21st, 1534, John Calvin left Noyon for the last time. He was 24 years old, and he had no home or church to return to. But he had a new mission. He was going to spread the message of the Bible and help people find the true faith. His journey was just beginning, and it would take him far beyond the familiar roads of his childhood. Calvin's journey was filled with danger and uncertainty, but his faith and determination never wavered. After leaving Noyon, he found himself in Paris, the heart of the city, where he had once studied and where many believers gathered in secret. Despite the risks, Calvin couldn't stay away from the people who needed his guidance. He knew the secret passwords and meeting places, and he would slip in and out of the homes of the faithful, teaching and encouraging them. The house of de la Forge was one of his safe havens, but even there his friend feared for his safety. Calvin spoke at many secret meetings, sometimes interrupted by the police. He learned to escape quickly, leaping through windows or melting into the darkness to avoid capture. At the end of his messages, he would raise his hands to heaven and say, "If God be for us, who can be against us?" Those who didn't escape and were caught by the police faced terrible fates, waiting in prison for their turn to be burned at the stake. They bore witness to the truth of Calvin's words even in their darkest moments. De la Forge urged Calvin to leave Paris, telling him that his life was not safe there. He argued that all of France needed Calvin, that the Protestants lacked a leader, and that they depended on him. Calvin hesitated, knowing that the people in Paris also needed him. He had an appointment with a young Spaniard named Servetus, who denied the Trinity and claimed to possess the only true truth. Servetus never showed up, but 19 years later, they would meet again in a Swiss city. Reluctantly, Calvin left Paris and moved on to other cities. He went to Poitiers, where he taught in a park, and later in a secret cave by torchlight. It was there that Calvin celebrated the Lord's Supper for the first time, using a flat rock as a table. He did it simply quoting the words of Christ, without the elaborate rituals of the Roman Catholic Mass. From Poitiers, Calvin sent out his first home missionaries to spread the word. The police were closing in again, and Calvin had to flee to Angoulême, where he stayed with his classmate du Tillet. people found him and pleaded for his teachings. Calvin, who called himself shy and bashful, found that his retreats became public schools for those seeking the truth. Next, Calvin went to Orleans, where he had studied law. There, he finished his first published writing after his conversion, a book in Latin called Psychopermachia. In it, he argued against the belief that the soul sleeps after death until the last judgment. Calvin believed the soul remains alive and awake, even after leaving the body. In Orleans, he also wrote 2 prefaces to the French translation of the Bible, completed by his cousin Olivetan. His writing was passionate and Christian, a stark contrast to his earlier academic work on Seneca. Around this time, posters protesting the Roman Catholic Mass appeared in Paris and other French cities. On the morning of October 18, 1534, these posters were found in many public places, even in the king's bedroom. King Francis I was furious and ordered a crackdown. The Church of Rome was enraged, and the affair of the placards led to widespread persecution. Protestants were arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake. Nowhere in France was a Protestant safe. Calvin, seeking peace to study and write, rode east toward the German border with his friend Louis Duthier. They traveled in harsh winter weather, always wary of being discovered. One morning, their servant stole their money and escaped, leaving them penniless. They managed to get enough money to reach Strasbourg, where Calvin had friends among the Protestant ministers. Pastor Martin Bucer helped the French refugees, and Calvin had written to him before. Calvin and Duthier continued south, and there is a story that Calvin stopped to visit the Dutch scholar Erasmus. Erasmus, who had once paved the way for the Reformation, had since made peace with the Pope. When Calvin visited, Erasmus was old and near death. How he received the young French leader is unknown, but it was a poignant meeting between 2 men on different paths. In early 1535, Calvin and Duthier arrived in Basel, a center of learning and printing. They found a temporary home, and Calvin rented a room from Madame Catherine Klein. He took the name Martianus, Lucanius, and began to write. Only a few people knew who Lucanius really was, including Nicolas Comte, the former rector of Paris. They shared news of the persecution in France, which was heartbreaking. Many of Calvin's friends and fellow believers had been burned at the stake, including de la Forge and the paralyzed shoemaker Milon. The news of these martyrs fueled Calvin's determination to defend their faith. King Francis I, no longer fickle, had turned against the Protestants. He claimed that those he persecuted were rebels and Anabaptists, trying to maintain alliances with Protestant states. Calvin, in exile, decided to speak out. He wrote a letter dedicating his book to King Francis, explaining the true faith of the Protestants and defending them against the lies. The book, originally meant as a guide for new believers, became a powerful confession of faith. Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion grew from 6 chapters to 80, becoming a comprehensive guide to the Protestant faith. He argued that the Protestants were peaceful and honest, and that their faith in God was the reason they suffered. He pleaded with King Francis to read the book and understand their cause, but the king never did. Calvin's words, however, would go on to shape the world, becoming a cornerstone of the Reformation and a beacon of hope for generations to come. John Calvin, the young French reformer, had arrived in the city of Ferrara, Italy, in 1536. Disguised as a monk, he was there to support the French Duchess, Renée, of France, who was married to Duke Hercules of Ferrara. The Duke, a powerful figure closely tied to the Church of Rome, was not pleased with his wife's Protestant beliefs. Calvin's mission was to strengthen René's faith and help her influence others in the court. But the situation was dangerous. The Inquisition was already questioning some of her friends, and the Duke was starting to crack down on her Protestant connections. Calvin met with the Duchess and her ladies-in-waiting in a small chapel near his room. He brought proof sheets of his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which he hoped would spread the Protestant message. Despite the risks, Calvin was able to speak with others in the court, but he had to be cautious. The castle was filled with priests and cardinals who were opposed to his teachings. During his stay, Calvin wrote letters to friends, including Gerard Roussel, a preacher who had returned to the Church of Rome. In his letter, Calvin expressed his disappointment but also his hope that Roussel would return to the Protestant faith. Calvin's time in Ferrara was short, lasting only 6 to 8 weeks, but it was intense. He knew he couldn't stay long, as the Duke was becoming suspicious of the visitors. When Calvin and his companion, Louis de Tillet, left Ferrara, they had to be quick and discreet. They escaped through the city gates, and some say Calvin preached along the way to the Alps, where he was sometimes welcomed and sometimes chased away. They likely traveled through the St. Bernard Pass, where the mountain streams were swollen with melted snow. Calvin's next destination was Paris. King Francis had offered a 6-month truce to Protestant exiles, allowing them to return to France without fear of persecution. Calvin took this opportunity to settle some family matters. He visited a notary and made his brother Antoine his attorney to handle the family property in Noyon. He also met with his stepsister Marie, who was supportive of his cause, while his other stepsister, who remained loyal to the Church of Rome, disapproved of his actions. In Noyon, the Calvin family was seen as a cautionary tale. Once respected, they were now viewed as heretics. John's father, Gerard, had died without making peace with the Church, and his brother Charles had been excommunicated and buried in unholy ground. John, the most notorious of them all, was seen as a dangerous heretic who was leading his family astray. With the 6 months of mercy coming to an end, Calvin knew he couldn't stay in France. He needed a safe place to study and write, so he decided to go to Strasbourg. However, the route to Strasbourg was blocked by a war between King Francis and Emperor Charles. Instead, Calvin took a detour through Lyons and planned to spend a night in Geneva before continuing his journey. Tired and dusty, Calvin arrived at the old Cornavin Gate of Geneva. He gave his name to the sentry and received a paper recommending him to the city's inns. He found a place to stay and planned to leave at daybreak. Little did he know that this stop in Geneva would change the course of his life and the Reformation. Meanwhile, in the Swiss cantons, the Reformation was spreading. The most powerful Protestant canton, Bern, was sending missionaries to convert the French-speaking regions. One of these missionaries was William Farel, a fiery and fearless man who had been converted by the old Professor Lefebvre. Farel was known for his bold and often confrontational approach. He would enter churches, climb the pulpit, and outshout the priests. He would pull relics from the hands of priests and throw them into the river. His preaching style was raw and unrefined, but it resonated with the uneducated folk who flocked to hear him. Farel trained a group of men to help him spread the Protestant faith. They were fearless and willing to face any danger. They would stay in a town long enough to convert some people and then send word to Bern, which would organize a public debate between Protestants and the Church of Rome. Many towns and villages declared themselves for the Reformation, and Bern would send new rules for worship and the sacraments. The Mass was abolished. and statues and altars were removed from the churches. Calvin's journey to Geneva and Farel's work in the Swiss cantons were about to intersect in a way that would shape the future of the Reformation. It was a crisp autumn day in 1532, exactly 1 year after Zwingli's death, when William Farel and his companion crossed the drawbridge into Geneva for the first time. John Calvin, meanwhile, was in Orleans, France, finishing his law studies after the disappointing sale of his book on Seneca. Geneva was a city of breathtaking beauty, nestled on a rocky hill beside a sparkling blue lake. Surrounded by a ring of mountains, some green and others snow-capped, the city was a natural wonder. The Rhone River, fed by the mountain streams, flowed through the city and onward to France and the Mediterranean. Geneva stood at the crossroads of Europe, making it a vital hub for trade and travel. The city's history was rich and complex. Julius Caesar had discovered Geneva 50 years before Christ and built defensive walls. By the 4th century, Geneva had grown into a bustling city, and Christianity had taken root, replacing pagan temples with churches. The most prominent of these was the Cathedral of St. Pierre, a grand stone structure with fortress-like towers that dominated the city's skyline. In 1532, Geneva was still fighting for its independence. It was not part of any Swiss canton and was locked in a bitter struggle against Duke Charles III of Savoy, who controlled the surrounding lands and castles. Inside the city, the bishop, who was the head of the church, also sought to rule over the citizens. The patriots of Geneva had fought hard for their freedom, and in 1525, Duke Charles had briefly captured the city. However, the patriots regrouped, cast aside their forced allegiance, and drove the Duke out. Geneva then formed alliances with the Protestant cantons of Bern and Fribourg, but the religious divide between these allies soon became a new source of conflict. Farel arrived in Geneva during this turbulent time. He took a room at the Inn Tour Perse and quietly announced his presence. The next day, he spoke to a group gathered at the inn, and by the second day, he was preaching to a larger crowd. The city's 900 priests were alarmed and quickly organized a mob to attack Farel and his companion. A group of town soldiers and officials intervened, breaking up the riot and escorting Farel to safety. That night, a guard stood watch outside his room, and the next morning, friends helped Farel and his companion escape across the lake. Farel, undeterred, soon returned with a new plan. He posted notices around the city, inviting people to learn French and receive free medical care. The teacher, a young man named Antoine Froment, taught French, but also shared Bible lessons and small sermons. The classes were popular, and soon the room was overflowing. On New Year's Day, 1533, Froment preached to a large crowd in Moulard Square, but an angry mob led by armed priests interrupted him. Froment managed to escape, but the seeds of the Reformation had been planted. The religious conflict in Geneva intensified. Protestant Bern sent a letter to the city councils, urging them to allow the truth to have free course. The people of Geneva were divided, and tensions ran high. In one dramatic incident, 700 priests and their followers, led by Canon Wernley, marched through the streets to Moulard Square, ready to fight. However, 7 merchants from Fribourg intervened, and the conflict was averted. Later, in May 1533, Canon Wernley was killed during a nighttime confrontation, further escalating the tensions. Bern, concerned about the treatment of Farel and Froment, sent a delegation to Geneva demanding a public debate. Farel returned to the city, along with Froment and a third preacher, Peter Viret. The public debate in St. Pierre Cathedral lasted a week and was a victory for the Protestants. However, before the Protestant cause could be put to a vote, the Duke of Savoy reappeared with an ultimatum. expel the preachers, take back the bishop, and submit to the Church of Rome, or face destruction. Geneva was in a precarious position. Bern advised submission, and the Swiss cantons echoed this advice. But the people of Geneva saw the ultimatum as a threat to their hard-won freedom. They decided to resist, even if it meant destruction. In August 1534, they began tearing down the suburbs to prevent the Duke's army from finding cover. They used the stones to fortify the city walls and melted church bells into cannonballs. The preachers, Farel and Viret, worked alongside the citizens, encouraging and supporting them. In April 1535, an attempt was made to poison the preachers, but only Viret fell ill. The incident strengthened support for the preachers, and in June, a second public debate was held. The preachers defended the Protestant faith, and the people cheered. On August 8, 1535, Farel preached the first Protestant sermon from the pulpit of St. Pierre Cathedral. The next day, he pleaded with the councils to formally recognize the Protestant faith. The councils, after hearing both sides, issued an edict on August 27, 1535, declaring that the religion of Rome would no longer be the religion of Geneva. The city transformed rapidly. Statues and altars were removed from the churches, and monasteries were repurposed. One became a free elementary school, and another a hospital. Priests, monks, and nuns were given the choice to stay or leave. Many chose to leave, and some, like the nuns of St. Clair, who had been in the convent for decades, faced a terrifying journey through the hills. The Duke of Savoy, now backed by the bishop and the pope, set up a full blockade around Geneva. The city faced starvation, but a messenger managed to reach Bern for help. Bern, threatened by the Duke's actions, declared war and marched to Geneva's aid. King Francis of France also joined the conflict, capturing the Duke's capital and two of his richest provinces. In February 1536, Bern's troops arrived at Geneva's gates, and the city was saved. Farel began to introduce new worship practices and rules. On Sunday, May 21, 1536, the people of Geneva gathered in St. Pierre Cathedral and swore to live according to the laws of the gospel. Forsaking the ways of Rome, the Reformation had come to Geneva, and the city's commitment to freedom and faith was stronger than ever. The year 1536 was a pivotal one for many. In Basel, the Dutch scholar Erasmus, who had once pointed the way to the scriptures but then turned back, passed away. In Nerac, the old Professor Lefebvre, known as the Morning Star of the Reformation, died after living more than a century in a world marked by turmoil. In London, Anne Boleyn, the second queen of Henry VIII, met her tragic end on the chopping block in the Tower of London. And in Geneva, a young traveler named John Calvin found his path forever altered. Calvin had planned to spend just one night in Geneva, a city still recovering from its struggle against the Duke. But fate had other plans. William Farel, a fiery and passionate preacher, had other ideas. Farel, who was used to storming cities and winning hearts for the gospel, found himself in a different kind of battle. The people of Geneva, who had once united against the Duke, were now slipping back into their old ways. Drunkenness, gambling, and immorality were rampant. The city needed a steady hand to guide it, and Farel believed Calvin was the man for the job. The two men met in a room lit by a single candle. Farel, stocky and short, spoke with a torrent of words, his voice ranging from a roar to a hoarse whisper. He paced the floor, pounded the table, and argued with a passion that could not be ignored. Calvin, thin and pale with piercing eyes, listened and protested. He was shy, he said, and often sick. He preferred the quiet of his study to the chaos of a city. But Farel was relentless. He pointed to heaven and thundered, "I say to you in the name of the Almighty God, if you will not help us to carry on this work of God, God will curse you." Calvin, feeling as if God's hand had arrested him, agreed to stay. Calvin's first few weeks in Geneva were anything but smooth. He fell ill with a cold that settled in his gums, and he had to be bled and treated with various remedies. Despite his illness, he began his work, lecturing on the epistles of Paul in the cathedral of Saint-Pierre. He was officially called a professor of sacred letters, but the city council only listed him as that Frenchman and took months to pay him. Calvin was troubled by the state of Geneva. The people who had sworn to live by the word of God were now living in sin. Taverns were full, and the streets were filled with drunkenness and immorality. Calvin knew he had a daunting task ahead. How could he teach these people the faith they had forgotten? In September, Calvin and Farel traveled to Lausanne for a public debate. The debate was meant to settle the religious future of the territories Bern had conquered from the Duke. Calvin, who had not expected to speak, rose to challenge a speaker for Rome. With a remarkable memory, he quoted from ancient church fathers, refuting the arguments against the Protestant faith. His speech was so powerful that many in the crowd were moved to embrace the Protestant faith. Back in Geneva, Calvin and Farel presented a confession of faith to the city council. The confession outlined the beliefs the people had promised to uphold. The council approved it, and the people were gathered to swear allegiance, but not everyone was happy. Some complained that they were being forced to swear to something they did not believe. The libertines, who enjoyed their loose living, and the patriots, who resented foreign control, began to stir up trouble. Calvin and Farel then presented a document to the little council, proposing 4 reforms for the church. One of the most controversial was the idea of excommunication. They believed the church should have the power to exclude those who lived wickedly from the Lord's Supper. This idea was met with fierce resistance. The council members saw it as a threat to their authority. They argued that they, not the church, should have the power to punish the wicked. Despite the challenges, Calvin remained committed to his task. He continued to lecture, write, and work on the reforms. The road ahead was long and difficult, but Calvin was determined to see Geneva become a city of God. The city of Geneva was a stormy place for John Calvin and his fellow preachers. They had a big task ahead, to reform the church and bring people closer to God. But the city council, the powerful group that ran Geneva, didn't always agree with them. This made things very difficult. Calvin and his friends, like William Farel and the blind preacher Corot, worked hard to change things. They wanted to teach children about God, make sure marriages followed the Bible, and let people sing psalms in church. They also believed that the church should have the power to exclude people who weren't living according to God's laws, especially when it came to the Lord's Supper. But the council didn't like this idea. They thought it gave too much power to the church and took away the freedom of the people. So, they dragged their feet and didn't fully support Calvin's reforms. They even put some of the preachers in jail and threatened to kick them out of the city. One day, the council ordered Calvin and Farel not to preach on Easter Sunday unless they agreed to use the old church practices that Bern, a powerful city nearby, wanted them to use. This was a big problem for Calvin and Farel because they believed these practices were too much like the old Catholic Church, which they had left behind. On Saturday night, a council messenger came to Calvin's door with the ultimatum. If Calvin and Farel didn't agree, they wouldn't be allowed to preach the next day. The streets were filled with angry people, some of whom were shouting and throwing things at the preachers' homes. It was a scary time for Calvin, who was only 28 years old and far from his home in France. Calvin and Farel decided they couldn't agree to the council's demands. They believed it was more important to follow God's word than to please the council. So, on Easter Sunday, they didn't go to their pulpits. Instead, they packed their bags and left Geneva. It was a hard decision, but Calvin knew it was the right one. He had tried his best to reform the church and bring people closer to God, but the council and the people of Geneva weren't ready to change. Calvin and Farel left the city, not knowing where their journey would take them next. But even as they left, Calvin held on to his faith and his conviction that God had a plan for him. He had faced a lot of challenges in Geneva, but he knew that his work wasn't over. He would continue to spread the message of God's love and truth, no matter where his path led him.